Welcome back. We're here in Matthew 22, so I hope you have the text before you as we go through it today. And it's interesting as we kind of round the corner into this last section of chapters of Matthew. They all take place in a shorter time frame than we've been in for the rest of the book of Matthew. So Lee, catch us up a little bit. Orient us. What are we seeing right now in this timeline?
Yeah, starting with our last lesson in Matthew 21, we've entered the final week, what's sometimes called the last week in Jesus' life, not counting after the resurrection. And the first event we saw was the triumphal entry of Jesus into Jerusalem, humble, but coming as a king, and then the clearing of the temple. And the triumphal entry was on Sunday, clearing of the temple was on Monday. And then Jesus, who was spending the nights out in Bethany with his friends out there, came back in on Tuesday and Wednesday for all-day teachings in the temple. And it was there that Jesus came into conflict with the Jewish religious leaders over his teaching and his identity. So today we're in that chapter 22 about his teachings.
So in the middle of some of those, we'll see more conflicts coming up as we go through that as well.
Yeah.
So we'll go ahead and dive right in as you take a look. We'll start with the parable of the wedding banquet, and this is verses 1 through 14. And it sounds like there's a lot really packed into this parable here. What jumps out to you as we take a look at it?
Well, this comes out of the context of the previous 2 days. The Jewish religious leaders were very critical of the way Jesus handled that triumphal entry and the way he accepted the praise of people, even children, who were crying out things like, "Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord." The leaders were very uncomfortable with that. And then you can imagine on Monday when Jesus went into the temple and starts clearing everything out that they had allowed to be set up there and was to their financial benefit, the conflict got even worse. So this parable is Jesus kind of pushing back and critiquing them, the Jewish religious leaders.
Okay.
The intro to the parable is much like the other parables in Matthew. The kingdom of heaven is like. And just as a reminder, when Jesus uses that phrase, he's not talking about heaven. He's talking about the kingdom of God, God's reign among human beings. And it's easy to think of this parable as an allegory in which every character, every event matches up exactly with some spiritual reality. And this one is not exactly an allegory. So it's better to think of the big picture here. What do we learn about God in general, not does God always act like this king acts, as we'll see later on. So starts out with a king who has prepared a wedding banquet for his son. And of course, as soon as we hear the word son, we think Jesus. Mm-hmm. Is there a bridegroom connection there? Is something we might occur to people. And I think you saw it, didn't you?
Yeah, we've seen that connection a few times, and you'll see, if you still have, I hope you have your reading guide, that if you look at Matthew, the Matthew 22 page, we encourage you to read Revelation 19, verses 6 through 8. And it uses this bridegroom image again. It talks about the wedding of the Lamb has come, the bride has made herself ready. And you pointed out that we've seen that in other places in Matthew as well. Is that right?
Yeah. Back in Matthew 9, they come to Jesus' disciples and say, "Why aren't you all fasting?" And Jesus said, "Well, fasting is related to mourning for sin, and my disciples aren't mourning right now because the bridegroom is with them. They should be filled with joy." So he kind of uses that bridegroom imagery there as well, and it pops up in Paul's letter to the Ephesians. So it's natural to connect Jesus to this bridegroom image here. The background of the way in which people were invited to events like weddings is a little different in our culture because they didn't have clocks and written invitations and things like that, as well as electronic stuff. They would send out messengers to announce big events well ahead of the event itself, and kind of like a save the date thing that we do nowadays.
Yeah.
Don't people do that?
Yeah, that's
Save this
true.
date for a wedding. So it's way off in the future, but save this date. And then, like the day before, they would say, okay, now don't forget, it's tomorrow, so, clear your calendar and come tomorrow. And then the day of, they might send messengers again. Remember, it's today, we'll come and get you when it's actually ready, and then they'll send them again. So there are these repeated efforts. And that's what the parable talks about, how the servants of the king keep going out and inviting people. I just thought it's helpful to know why so many invitations, right?
That's a normal thing that
Yeah.
you would see in this context.
But their response to the invitations wasn't very positive, was it?
Yeah, you'd think that they would want to go, and they seem just they're not fazed by it. They're not really
No.
interested. Yeah.
And not only disinterested, but their response gets more and more violent as it goes. And finally, it says they mistreated and killed the servants. That's in verse 6. The king got so angry that he sent an army into this area, and it says, destroyed those murderers and burned their city. This is where we know that this isn't an allegory describing exactly what God does. If we want to get a picture of what God is like from this parable, it's better to look at the next verses, like in verse 10. So the servants went out into the streets and gathered all the people they could find, the bad as well as the good, and the wedding hall was filled with guests. So the initial invitation would have gone to the king's friends, probably the nobility of the land. But here we see that because they rejected the invitation has now gone to everybody. And that is a beautiful picture of God's grace, it seems to me.
It's opened up to everybody.
To
Is
everybody.
there anything there about, we've talked a lot about how it's going beyond just the Israelites. Is that it's a connection at all?
Well, there's not a direct reference to that in this parable.
Okay.
But I think in Matthew's mind, there may well have been, as you just said, so often in the Gospel of Matthew, we've seen Jesus' interest in reaching out to Gentiles as well as Jews. So they might be included in that all. Doesn't say directly.
Okay.
And then there's one kind of little P.S. to this parable about the wedding guest who isn't wearing the wedding clothes. I think you found out a little bit about wedding clothes, right?
Yes, yeah. I was reading about how, because we can read that and think that it sounds so harsh. How did you get in here? And I think my first instinct is, like, you invited him, like you told him to come. We hear about all these invitations, all these people being welcomed. And I came across something that said wedding clothes were usually provided. And that just makes a huge difference to think that, especially if it is, God's grace being extended out, that this person chose not to accept that really, or put on the grace, or put on whatever it might be. I think you had some ideas of there are different ways we can think of the garments.
Yeah, the way I think of it is the problem here is that the guest is insisting on coming to the banquet on his own terms and won't come on the terms of the master, the king, who invited that. And that's a problem, I think, for all people who kind of want to be part of the kingdom, but then don't want to come on God's terms. We want to come on our own terms. At least that's a temptation in my life. So
Yeah.
I think that maybe is the spiritual reality that's behind this. There's one other statement here that can be really confusing. It's back in verse 8. He said to the servants, the wedding banquet is ready, but those I invited did not deserve to come. That kind of raises in our mind the notion of the reason why they didn't come is that the king was judging them and thought, oh, well, you deserve, you've done lots of good works or something like that. Oh, wait, you don't deserve, you haven't done good works. That isn't what's going on here at all. The reason they didn't come and the reason they didn't deserve to come is that they refused to come.
That they didn't want to. Yeah,
Exactly.
they said no.
Exactly.
Okay.
So it's not that the king has disqualified them because they didn't live up to certain expectations. That's a works righteousness there. The problem is that they disqualified themselves. And it is possible to do that, I think, in the kingdom. At least it sounds like it. So.
All right.
Well, those are some of the insights that come out of the parable.
Yeah, that's beautiful. There's lots of great stuff in there. I love how we can learn so much from that of what it means to accept Jesus' invitation, and how you said that we are changed by it. That's very convicting and compelling to hear. We can go ahead on to the next section. We see that that's in verses 15 through 22. I think, and you were talking about, we see a lot of different testing happening. So tell us about this part.
Yeah. Well, Jesus kind of began this section of teaching, putting the focus on the Jewish religious leaders and challenging them, critiquing them. Well, now they really turn the tables on Jesus and come after him. So we get three really strong challenges here. The first is kind of based on politics. It's a political test related to taxation, to Roman taxation. The second one is out of a different background. It's kind of a doctrinal issue. What do you believe about the resurrection? And then the third is got a legal basis. That's a challenge to Jesus about how to interpret the Mosaic Law. So different ones of the Jewish religious leaders are coming at Jesus, one right after another, to try to trip him up and discredit him in the eyes of the people.
Okay.
Yeah.
So a lot of different tests that we're going to cover for the rest of this chapter. Okay.
Yeah.
So if we start with this first one, we see the Pharisees and the Herodians come together. And that's already an interesting one. Those aren't two groups you would put together ever, probably.
Right. It's very important to know a little bit of the historical background there as related to Roman rule. The Pharisees were the ones who were very devoted to God, very devoted to the scriptures, and to living righteous lives in obedience to God. And they wanted to have nothing to do with Gentiles or paganism or idolatry or anything like that. So not only were they offended by Roman political oppression, which was terrible, but the fact that the Romans were polytheists and pagans who were ruling them was just deeply offensive. So the Pharisees were anti-Rome. Now, not violently.
Okay.
There was a group called the Zealots who actually took up arms against Rome. The Pharisees didn't do that, but they were definitely politically opposed to Roman rule. The Herodians were at the opposite end of the spectrum. They supported, from their name, the King Herods, the various Herods who ruled, who had been appointed by Rome. So calling them Herodians is like saying they're the Rome party.
Okay.
They like the fact that Rome is controlling their land. And so they're just as opposite as can be. And they come together. It's a kind of politics makes strange bedfellows, you know.
Yeah.
Or the friend of my enemy is my. How does?
I don't remember. Yeah, I know what you're saying.
At any rate,
an enemy of my enemy is my friend. Something like that. I don't know.
At any rate, they come to try to trap Jesus. These two groups that never talk to each other are now united in their opposition to Jesus. So the question is, should we pay taxes or not? Now, this is a Roman imperial tax placed on non-citizens.
Okay.
So Romans didn't pay this tax. It was people they had conquered who paid this tax. So paying this tax was doubly, nobody likes taxes, right? But this was doubly painful because it was a symbol of outside oppression on them to pay this tax.
And they're kind of funding the people who are continuing to oppress them.
Yeah, they're funding the army that is crucifying them. This was really, really painful. And Jesus does a fascinating thing. He asks to see a coin. And you noticed what kind of a coin it is, right?
Yeah, that there are a few different types of coins, and on this one it would have the image of Caesar on it, and that alone would be kind of a threat to Jews because it's an image. You know, they're saying this is someone who's like God, and that it might have even had something inscribed on it like that. So it's really interesting that they're bringing that up and asking about that.
Yeah, this is a piece of idolatry right here, this coin. And there were other coins that they could have had. Jews had shekels, and many people used Greek drachmas, but this is the Roman coin that has the image of Tiberius Caesar on it, and that's the point Jesus wants to make. He says, okay, well, whose image is on this coin? And they say, well, Caesar's is, and it was Tiberius Caesar. So here he's kind of jabbing at the Pharisees a little bit by saying, look, if you're going to use Roman coinage, then I guess you're going to have to pay Roman taxes. You know, if you're using the benefit of Roman rule, you're going to do that. But his real point comes in the next statement, but render to God what is God's. And there I think we need to remember this term that Jesus has used, image. Whose image is on this? Because I'm convinced his point is that we are made in the image of God. So what do we render to God? That which has his image on it, in it, that's us.
Ourselves.
Yeah. And so what do we render to God? Our whole selves. And that's a message that the Pharisees needed to hear just as badly as the Herodians, who were not very religious people, not very godly people. They needed to be reminded that they were sinning by putting their national political loyalties ahead of God.
Okay.
The Pharisees needed to be reminded that they were tempted to put the law and their own obedience, their own righteousness ahead of God even. And so there's kind of a reminder here for all of us that that God has to come first in every area of our lives.
Yeah, that if we're in the image of God, then everything we have, all of who we are, that would go to God.
Yeah.
I came across something too reminding us of, that means Caesar was in the image of God. So sure, he's getting some coins, but in a sense, Caesar is God's too. So he should be given to God what is God's.
Yeah.
Probably wasn't happening, but it is an interesting thing to be reminded of that image of God. That's really powerful. And again, you kind of said this, but to realize too that Jesus was definitely in a situation that was a no-win situation. If he had said, yeah, sure, pay your taxes, that would have made the Pharisees kind of upset. And if he said not to pay taxes, well, he could have been crucified already from that. Is that right? That he really could have, he was walking into this trap.
He was, and he could have easily cut his losses. You know, he could have thought, okay, well, there's a lot, the Pharisees are a lot more popular than the Herodians. Let me come down on their side and scold the Herodians for not being religious or something, you know, kind of cut his losses there. But he doesn't cut his losses. He walks right into a no-win situation and answers in a way that he doesn't win with anybody.
Wow.
He made the Pharisees and the Herodians angry, I'm sure, from his answer.
It's a lot there.
Yep.
Anything else you wanted to cover on this one before we go to the next test?
No, we better move on to the second challenge. And this is a different group of religious leaders, the Sadducees, who were the priests at the temple. It's important to remember. They're the ones running the temple religious rituals. They were very wealthy as a class of people and were not especially religious. I mean, in terms of personal spirituality.
Okay.
It seems a little contradictory.
They're priests, but they're not religious.
Yes,
Okay,
yes.
yeah.
But that's true. I'm not trying to just diss the guys, but they were not especially religious people. One thing that made them very different from Jesus and the Pharisees is that they only accepted the first 5 books of the Old Testament as inspired, the Torah, you know, the books of Moses. And they didn't pay any attention to the other history books, prophecy, book of Psalms, none of that. So, and what makes this scene work is the fact that they don't believe in the afterlife. Again, that strikes us as a little odd that the priests don't believe in the afterlife, but Pharisees did believe in an afterlife, but the Sadducees didn't. The other thing that's important to understand about this test here is that they have picked out, I don't want to call it an obscure law, but maybe people don't know much about it. It's a marriage law that relates to what happens when a brother dies. A married brother dies without having born children. The living brother, it was expected, according to Deuteronomy chapter 25, was expected to marry and have a child by the deceased brother's wife. And that child would be the heir of the deceased brother. That was a way mainly of keeping inheritance flowing properly in families. And that, not only do we see that law in Deuteronomy 25, did you put that in your notes, by the way? Deuteronomy 25?
In the reading plan?
Yeah.
I don't know if I did that one,
Okay,
actually.
I'll mention
so
it then
explain it, yeah.
to our listeners. It's Deuteronomy 25, verses 5 through 10.
Okay.
So somebody might want to look that up. It's interesting. And the actual cases of it do come up a couple times in the Old Testament. Once with Judah, that is the son of Jacob and Leah. Judah, his son died, and then another son married, and then he died, another son. So they were obviously following that law. And then it also takes place in the book of Ruth.
Okay.
Yeah, because Ruth is a widow, and a cousin is expected to marry her and have a child for the deceased husband, but he gives up that right to Boaz, and Boaz takes that role. Yeah. So it's interesting. So this is a real law, and it was a real thing that Israelite people really practiced. What the Sadducees do is make up a absolutely ridiculous situation in which they've stretched this law to its ridiculousness, and they say, what happens if we got 7 brothers and each one dies before a child is born? And then in the afterlife, in the resurrection, whose wife is she going to be? So they're kind of mocking that marriage law, but they're mainly mocking anybody, including Jesus, who thinks that there's an afterlife.
They're just making it seem totally ridiculous.
Yeah, that's what they're doing. Jesus pushes right back. It's interesting. I think the verse really to look at is verse 29. After they give this ridiculous situation, Jesus says, "You are in error." In other words, you're dead wrong, because you don't know the scriptures, you don't know the power of God, and then he goes on in verse 30 to basically say, and you don't understand the afterlife, you don't understand the resurrection. Well, that's pretty harsh to priests who said, you don't really, and this is the part of the scripture that they accepted, Deuteronomy, right?
Yeah. So
It's
calling that out,
you don't understand your own scriptures, and you certainly don't understand the power of God to raise from the dead and create life after death, and you don't understand the nature of relationships in the resurrection either. He goes on to say, there's neither marrying nor giving in marriage in the resurrection. So relationships are going to be kind of different.
Yeah, I was coming across some ideas that said just that it was saying it's not like we expect the resurrected life to look exactly the same. And there's something hopeful about that. I think otherwise, what is the hope that God is calling us to if it's just an extension of our normal sinful lives here? And to be reminded, even the idea of who's getting the inheritance, well, that's kind of a messed up way of thinking. That implies that there's continuing to be death, and that's the whole point of the resurrection. There is no longer death, and you would think that the need for inheritance wouldn't exist anymore in that. So there's a lot in this passage.
Right. I think this does teach us that we need to make sure that our expectations for the resurrection aren't just this life warmed over, is kind of what you're
I like
saying
that,
there.
yeah.
There's something that's going to keep our focus on the glory of God that goes beyond normal interpersonal relations.
Yeah.
Yeah. All right, shall we do the third
That
test?
sounds good. Yeah, we come to the next one,
Okay.
verses 34 through 40, and now it's just the Pharisees coming back, I guess, after, I like how it says, hearing that Jesus had silenced the Sadducees. That's a pretty powerful phrase there. But then the Pharisees get together and they come with a question, which is the greatest commandment in the law? So respond to that for us.
And the person who they put forward to ask this question is described by Matthew as an expert in the law. And that's what the Pharisees aspired to. They just wanted to know the law, and they had picked out these 613 absolutely essential commandments. So, which is the greatest commandment? Now, the fact that there were 613 commandments that they thought every good Jew ought to obey makes that kind of a trick question, because if he names one and raises it above all the others, then they might say to him, oh, well, what about all the others? Are you discounting them? So Jesus, in a sense, takes a risk by naming the one from Deuteronomy 6:5, you shall love the Lord your God with your whole being. On the other hand, it's not a big risk, because most Jews had come to see that law calling on love for God as the highest expression of Jewish faith. It was called the Shema because that's the first Hebrew word in it. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God is one. You shall love the Lord your God with your whole being. It was kind of like the John 3:16 of Judaism.
Yeah, okay.
If you knew one verse that kind of summed up Christianity, it would be John 3:16. If you wanted to identify one verse in the Hebrew Scriptures that summed up the Israelites' understanding of their relationship with God, it would be the Shema, Deuteronomy 6. But Jesus takes a really big risk by adding one and saying, oh, wait, there's a second that's right up there on a par with the great Shema, and that's Leviticus 19:18. You shall not only love the Lord, your God, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. And Jesus had already, in the Sermon on the Mount, expanded the definition of neighbor, right?
Yeah, he made it even harder to think of how you would love someone. It was a lot more involved maybe than you would want it to be.
Yeah.
Not as basic. Yeah.
And he said, your neighbor might at times be your enemy. So Jesus has already reinterpreted the law in that area. And so what we're left with here is not only his thoughtful, challenging answer to the testing of the Pharisees on this matter of the greatest commandment, but he leaves us with a beautiful challenge, I think, to balance love for God and love for one another in our lives as well.
You'll find that in the reading plan for this, you're encouraged to read Romans 13, which talks about how the fulfillment of the law is love. Love is the fulfillment of the law. And I think that's such a good reminder for us and the Pharisees in this time. Like you said, let's follow every single one of these 613 laws, and to see that when you're loving, that's actually the whole reason for these laws, that we would love God and love each other, that would all flow out of that. So it's a good reminder for all of us.
Good.
Should we go on to our last section we have? It says, Jesus tests the Pharisees. So it's interesting that he's been kind of getting tested. They keep coming after him. And then it wraps up with verses 41 through 46. And Jesus asks them a question. He says, what do you think about the Messiah? Whose son is he? So what do you see in this?
Well, they have a quick answer. He's the son of David, which is true in a sense. But then Jesus picks out this quotation from Psalm 110, in which it says, the Lord said to my Lord, sit at my right hand till I put your enemies under your feet. And there, David is using the term Lord for the Messiah. So Jesus is saying, oh, it's not enough just to say that Jesus is the descendant of David, as wonderful an affirmation as that is. He's actually David's Lord. And this, I think, kind of sums up one of the themes that we've seen throughout Matthew's gospel. Matthew frequently quotes and points out expressions which talk about the greatness of Jesus, the greatness of the Messiah. He began with John the Baptist, who said, somebody greater than me is coming. I can't even tie his shoelaces, And then it keeps going. Greater than the temple is here. Greater than Jonah is here. Greater than Solomon is here. Greater than Elijah, the great prophet, is here. And now here, clearly, greater than David, David's Lord. And so, and you noticed with the...
In this passage, we could say that he's greater than Caesar as
right,
to add that in. Yeah.
Right, with the coin. So Matthew has really been emphasizing that, and it comes to a wonderful climax right here about the greatness of Jesus.
I love that we can see that after all this, and we've kind of seen it on display, that Jesus is greater than even all of their little questions about, as they're kind of trying to split hairs a little bit here, that Jesus is greater than all of these things, and that we want to make sure we don't limit who Jesus is. Would you say that's kind of a good takeaway for us, or how would you sum this up for us?
Oh, that's beautiful. It's so easy to put, political loyalties or personal preferences or even our own obedience, our own righteousness. It's so tempting to put things as if they're the goal of our spiritual lives. And we don't, I think, even realize sometimes what we're doing is undermining the greatness of God and the focus that we need to be putting on God and His Son, our Savior. And so this chapter is a great reminder for us as well.
It really directs our attention. I think, as we wrap up, I think that my main takeaway that I hope you can sit in today is give back to Caesar what is Caesar's, but to God what is God's. That as we're looking at all these things, all the things in your life that you might want to hold on to and cling to, that we remember that we are made in the image of God, and that God is so great, Jesus is so great, and we want to give everything back to God and not get lost in all these other things that sometimes fight for our attention or our allegiance. So I hope you'll take that challenge with you this week as you continue to study Matthew 22. Join us next week as we continue along.